As we continue on our rather quickly paced chronological journey through the Bible, we might remember that last week's story recounted God coming to Abram in a vision and renewing the magnifying promise of descendants, magnifying that promise of land and descendants and blessing. So sure enough, Abram does have many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and their stories are told and retold over many, many centuries before they are finally woven together and written down in engaging and sometimes brutally honest detail. In the book of Genesis, we read of the lives and misadventures and ups and downs and family dysfunction passed down generationally, particularly through Abram and Sarah and their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah and their grandson Jacob, and finally through Jacob's son, which we heard one of them is Joseph. And in today's story, is about Joseph, who, as Connie just said, and you might remember from Broadway musicals or full-feature animated movies or even your Sunday school days, that Joseph is indeed Jacob's favorite son. And he knows he's Jacob's favorite son. And he carries himself like Jacob's favorite son, strutting around in that special robe, sharing dreams of grandeur, of his own grandeur, tattling on his brothers, not attempting to hide that air of arrogance and sense of entitlements. Well, long short of it is Joseph is a spoiled brat and a bragger, and his brothers not only resent him, but as Scripture says more strongly than Connie says, they hate him. And we know what hate does, don't we? Especially when we allow it to fester over the years. The long saga that we find in chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis. We see Joseph being sold by his brothers into slavery, working his way into one of the more plum positions of servanthood, and then being imprisoned for something he didn't do, being a seat of power after he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, and then he manages all of Egypt's agricultural economy during a time of famine, which brings him back into contact with his brothers who have come to Egypt in search of food, which eventually leads to Joseph moving his brothers and their father Jacob and their families and everything to Egypt, where they are finally given a good land and good livelihoods as shepherds. Like Connie said, a lot happened. And after Joseph had been reunited with his brothers, 17 years later, Jacob died a happy man together with his family, and Joseph made sure that Jacob was returned to his homeland for burial, where they offered that burial in grand fashion. Now, the return to their homeland after all these years, when they buried their father, when they returned back to Canaan, they must have uncovered some very painful childhood memories that they had tried to bury. Their memories came flowing back. Memories of throwing Joseph into the pit, of selling him, of lying to their father that Joseph had been killed. And these memories no doubt triggered guilt and shame and fear. After all, now their little brother had power over them, and now that their father was buried and out of the picture, what was keeping Joseph from punishing them for all the heartache and suffering he had experienced over the years? And this is where today's passage picks up. I encourage you to read along in the insert, the passage, and let's listen together.
Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him? So they approached Joseph, saying, Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. The word of God for the people of God.
So, whatever else this story might be about, it's a story of guilt, and it's a story of fear. The brothers haven't forgotten about their cruelty to Joseph so many long years ago, and no doubt they still carry a heavy burden of guilt related to their despicable behavior. Guilt that became heavier when they saw how it had brought their father such grief and despair for so many years, and perhaps when they had learned how Joseph had suffered alone for so many years. All of us know at some level or other what it feels like to carry guilt, and how guilt seems to rear its head and weigh us down, even when we think we have succeeded in burying it forever in the deep recesses of our hearts and minds. We know what it's like when something triggers memories of occasions, whether these occasions were long ago or just yesterday, occasions when our actions or our words inflict harm on others, or when our failure to act or speak out has hurt another deeply. We know what it feels like to carry guilt. And in this story, guilt looms large. But it's not the only thing that Joseph's brothers experience. Because you see, in this story, fear looms larger. With the death of their father, Joseph's brothers are afraid that Joseph is going to do something awful to them, maybe even kill them. Now, Joseph didn't dare do that as long as their beloved father was alive, for he knew that it would cause great grief to his father, the father who, yes, loved Joseph the most, but who loved his other sons as well. So it would have grieved Joseph greatly if Joseph had sought revenge on his brothers while Jacob was still alive. Their brothers knew this, and it offered them some level of protection. So they weren't afraid as long as Jacob was still part of their story. But now Jacob's dead, and now they are shaking in their boots. So what do? Well, they don't come to Joseph eating humble pie, or confessing their sins, or placing themselves at his mercy. Instead, as this passage says, they allow their fear to become the controlling force in their lives. Driven by fear, they spin a false story that they hope will get them the results they want. They fabricate a story about how their father, just before he died, told them to tell Joseph that he, Jacob, wants the great and powerful Joseph to forgive his brothers. But the truth is that Jacob never told these brothers to tell Joseph that. You can read Genesis from front to back, and you won't find any place where the dying Jacob tells the brothers to bring this message of forgiveness to Joseph. Fear causes the brothers to tell an outright lie. Fear leads them to try to control their own storyline, doing whatever it takes to come out on top. Fear gives them the permission to manipulate Joseph's forgiveness. Fear keeps them from being able to trust Joseph, even though Joseph has done nothing except take care of them in all these 17 years since they have been reunited as family. Fear makes them unable to confess for themselves their own guilt and to ask for mercy, and instead makes them stoop so low as to hide behind their dead father's name in a misguided attempt to spin a good ending to their long saga. Yes, fear causes them to say and do things that didn't reflect the truth of who they are as God's promised and precious children, children born to be a blessing. And fear can do the same thing in us. Fear can do the same thing to us. It can destroy who we are at the core of our being. And if we give into its power, that potent formula of buried guilt mixed with unchecked fear will quite literally suck the life out of us, causing us to spend all of our energy putting false spins on our own stories, our own life, and sadly misguided efforts to save ourselves, to be seen as acceptable to others and to God. It's enough to make us weep. And that's exactly what happens next. Joseph weeps first. Now, this is not the first time Joseph has wept. 17 years ago, he had already shed many a tear on his journey toward forgiving his brothers and being reunited with his family. And now, Joseph weeps once more when he realizes the truth that their reconciliation wasn't really what he thought it was. It wasn't really complete. He realizes that his brothers don't really trust that he had really forgiven them years ago. He wept because that guilt and shame still weighed heavy on his brothers. He wept because he realized that they actually still fear him. And then the older brothers weep. Now, this is the first time that they have wept throughout the entire Joseph saga. But let's not let ourselves be fooled by their tears. Their weeping, you see, is self-centered. It's born of fear. It's designed to manipulate Joseph into playing God and forgiving them. And Joseph must have seen the fear in them, because he says, wait a minute, I'm not God. I'm not the one to judge, so don't be afraid. He is at least saying, don't be afraid of me, because I'm not going to harm you. But he's also saying, don't be afraid of God, because the God I have come to know and trust, the same God of our ancestors, is not going to harm you any more than I am, because that's not what God does. And then Joseph gives his spin on the story. And his story, we will notice, is devoid of fear, devoid of guilt. It challenges his brothers to let go of their fear and guilt. Brothers, Joseph says, if God intended to harm you for trying to harm me, God would not have brought you down here to Egypt 17 years ago so that you could be fed. God would not have put me in a position to receive you and take care of you all those years ago. God would not have provided you with a good and abundant life for all these 17 years. Far from wanting to harm you, God intends good for you. So you don't need to be afraid, Joseph says. And then Joseph offers this reassuring promise. He says to his brothers, I'll take care of you and your children. As if he was saying it for the first time. That's what Joseph says to his brothers. And that is what God is saying through this story to us. God's saying, you don't need to be afraid of punishment from me. So don't try to manipulate my forgiveness. It has already been given. God is saying, and you certainly don't need to punish yourself by holding on to your guilt, by allowing fear and shame to dictate your life. In other words, God says to us in a nutshell, don't be afraid. I've forgiven you already. I'll take care of you. So trust me on this. And that's how the story ends. That's how the book of Genesis ends. And with its ending comes a brand new story, a new beginning, a new supporting cast, and a new set of problems. But at the center of this new story that's coming up is the same God who continues to speak words of assurance and presence and redemption. Now let me repeat those 4 divinely nuanced phrases that come from today's story. And as I say them again, I want you to listen for the particular phrase that resonates with you right now. Claim that phrase and let it be the touchstone, a reminder that opens you up to a new beginning in your life. So here are the phrases again. Don't be afraid. I've forgiven you. I'll take care of you. Trust me on this. So which of these phrases speak to you in this moment? As we move into a time of prayer, rather than having us bring our own stuff to God, rather than us trying to tell God what to do on our behalf, I'm going to ask us instead to listen for what God is bringing to us through this story, to listen for what God has been saying to us since the beginning. Now, we've got some time, and for those of you who are more contemplative in your spirituality, I'm going to give us some time. And during this time, I'm going to ask that you sit quietly in the sacred silence and the safety that is here, and repeat your touchstone phrase over and over in your mind. Let it rest in your heart and speak to your soul. So to prepare, everyone, take a deep breath. Take a couple of deep breaths and close your eyes. Close your eyes and repeat that that divinely grounded phrase that you need to hear in this moment. I'm going to say the phrases one more time and center in on one of those. Don't be afraid. I've forgiven you. I'll take care of you. Trust me on this. Now, with another breath and with your eyes still closed, let us enter into this time of silent prayer.
To